He used to play Russian roulette with the kids. He would take a loaded pistol and spin the barrel and put it up against their head.
Today's case is a case like no other.
He would kick her in the head, kick her in the stomach. She was bloody regularly.
This is one of the worst cases on the internet.
At one point, he tried to drown her, and he held her underwater with his foot on her head.
The twists and turns of this case are wild, so let's jump right into it. Beautiful souls, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Carolyn. This channel is all about true crime, mystery, and anything abnormal. Highly recommend subscribing because this channel is definitely a vibe. When the police started looking into a missing persons case, they ended up finding two murder mysteries waiting to be solved. On September 10th, 1988, two officers from the Orlando police were visiting a Kananen house that was quiet and unnervingly so. It was a missing persons case against a 65-year-old woman by the name of Sherrilyn Dale. That is what had brought the police to the home. They had no idea that this would become one of the most twisted and unforgettable puzzles for them and for Sherrilyn's three children. The three children, Cheryl, Rick, and Stacy, sat in silence registering a complaint against their mother, hoping that the police could find where their mother was or what had happened to her. It wasn't like Sherrilyn to disappear. She was an extremely punctual woman. She was very responsible. She would never fail to show up for her job at the aviation academy.
She worked for a training academy for Delta employees, and she had been there 20 plus years. According to everyone who knew her, she was there early every morning. She was a very loyal and dependable employee. She had never done anything like this before.
Cheryl had learned of her mother's absence the morning before, and now, 24 hours later, she had a gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong.
I stood in the kitchen by the refrigerator, and I got goosebumps, and I said, something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong.
The Orlando police listened carefully as Cheryl recounted the past day. Sherrilyn's children were visibly disturbed, and they were exchanging glances between the three of them. This interview with the Kananen children was about to become very, very strange for the officers. The investigators asked the children, was there anyone that they suspected? And the person that they suspected was very shocking. They believed their long missing father, who had been extremely abusive to the family, had returned and taken their mother. Now, what made this so strange is that the father, he had been missing for the last 20 years. And what made it even more unsettling was when the father had gone missing, he was 49 years old. Police believed that the trauma that the children had gone through as a child had led them to believe that their now 69-year-old father had returned 20 years later to kidnap or harm their mother. There was no sign of forced entry, and there was no sign of foul play.
The last thing my dad ever said to me was, someday, somewhere, I'll get you. And I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill somebody that you care about.
As the officers looked around for clues in Sherrilyn's living room, there was a half-drank cup of coffee that was forgotten on a table, and next to it was a stack of unopened Social Security checks. Details that shouldn't have stood out, but now seemed quite significant. The officers knew that this would not be a straightforward missing person case. The Kananen family scars ran deep, and whatever had happened to Sherrilyn seemed to be tangled up in secrets that spanned decades. To uncover the truth, they were going to have to go back and start at the beginning, where the real mystery began. Marilyn's sister and the children assisted the detectives in piecing together the Kananen's family's troubled past and a source of ongoing trauma for all of them. Richard Allen Kananen was 21 years old when he met 16-year-old Marilyn Reagan. Despite their differences, they fell in love very quickly. Marilyn was a petite girl full of dreams, and Richard was a very large man that was covered in tattoos of snakes and skulls. From the exterior, the two did not look like they made a good match. Richard worked in a shipyard, and he was a well-known ex-convict, and he usually made his money through doing scams and just doing any type of crimes, types of things that he could do to make money, and he was quite constantly relocating to avoid the consequences of the crimes he would commit. It's hard to imagine looking at these beautiful pictures that their marriage was a ticking time bomb. Their life together was about to be as strange and cruel. But that didn't start them from starting a family. First came Rick, named after his father. 8 years later, they welcomed Cheryl, and 2 years after that, their youngest, Stacy. By 1979, the Kananen family was exhausted from all of the moving, so they decided to buy a house in Orlando, Florida, and settle down. But the peace, it was a mirage. The quiet neighborhood offered no escape from the horrors that were happening inside the home. Richard, a man consumed with alcohol, would not only lash out when he would be drinking, he would lash out at any moment over anything. His abuse was part of the daily routine for the 3 children and for Marilyn. What should have been a home became a house of horrors. Richard's presence stretched far deeper than the chaotic, rootless years that preceded Orlando. The damage that Richard inflicted on his children went far beyond the physical abuse. It burrowed deep into the children's minds. To them, he was no longer their father. He was a figure that they could not escape.
They didn't call him Dad. They called him It or the Monster.
Monsters and nightmares wore the face of Richard Kananen. Richard created his own twisted hell house where his family became his subjects, and they were bound by silence and fear. Torture was not just a possibility, it was a definite reality, but it was something that everyone kept very quiet. His dominance extended to their entire lives, into who they spoke with, who they met, where they went, who they interacted with. Interaction with the outside world was forbidden. The idea of friendships or visitors to the home was completely out of the question. His control was absolute, leaving the family trapped in a life governed by fear and torture. He also had a pattern of torture for each of his children. Rick, who was the oldest, and he was also, for the first 8 years of his life, he was also the only child in the home. He witnessed horrific things happening between his mother and father. His mother, he would witness her being violated, abused, just horrific things. And he himself suffered the exact same torture at the hands of his father. The abuse for Rick was not just physical, it was also sexual, and he would be beaten to the point of becoming unconscious. And at one point, he was chained to a doghouse outside for days. Cheryl witnessed violence that often escalated into something far worse. Richard would lead her into his room, lock the door, and whatever transpired inside those walls was too horrific for her young mind to even process. Her memories of those moments were wiped clean, leaving a haunting void. Yet the physical pain of the beatings always remained vivid. Each time Cheryl got the courage to actually tell her mother about the horrible essay that she was suffering at the hands of her father, she was cruelly dismissed by Marilyn. Marilyn, rather than offering comfort or protection, she accused Cheryl of lying. So not only was she dealing with the abuse that she was suffering, she was also dealing with the fact that her mother didn't believe her. As for Stacy, who is the youngest daughter, Richard asserted that she was his only biological daughter. This is not true, but for some reason, he would claim that she was his only biological daughter.
Stacy described his eyes, that he had black eyes like a shark.
She, as well, like her sister, was essayed on a regular basis by her father.
Stacy's telling of him is that he was huge. He was over 6 feet tall, over 300 pounds.
One day when the family was taking a car ride, Richard announced that Stacy would be sleeping in bed with him at night. So normally, obviously, Richard and Marilyn slept in the main bedroom. Richard decided, nope, that's where Stacy and him were going to sleep. And obviously, his reasoning for that was horrific essay that Stacy suffered. And finally, she got a little bit of relief when he disappeared for 2 weeks. The problem was he came back and he had even more twisted, horrible, disgusting, horrific things that he had planned to do to his family. There was no limit to how much pain Richard was willing to inflict on his family. And Marilyn, she wasn't a great mother at all. She was very abusive to the children as well. And I mean, we already know when her daughter has told her that her father essayed her, she told her daughter she was lying. So she did a lot of gaslighting and manipulation, but she was very abusive as well. And obviously the children end up growing up. And as soon as they could get out of the house, they wanted to. Rick was the first one to move out of the house, and his presence at the home after he moved out was not very often. The only time he would see the family is if it was centered around something specific that he was invited to, or if there were chores or errands that needed to be done. Years later, on a particular day, after Richard had finished beating Cheryl, he wished her a happy 18th birthday. And Cheryl moved out of the house that day. With Cheryl and Rick gone, only Stacy and Marilyn remained trapped in the oppressive grip of Richard. Even the two that had escaped, they may have gotten out of the house, but they weren't away from Richard's horrors. By 1988, Cheryl was 24 years old, and she was secretly planning her wedding. Not to protect the romance, but out of fear of her father. Richard had no intention of giving the couple his blessing. He had actually threatened to kill Cheryl and her soon-to-be husband on their wedding day. The terror ran so deep that even guests that were invited were nervous and not sure if they wanted to attend the wedding out of fear. Because one thing about Richard is his threats were never empty. He always followed through. And each day leading up to the wedding was a terrifying countdown. Yet 2 weeks before the big day, something very unexpected happened. A remarkable turn of events unfolded, one that would alter the course of Cheryl's life and the lives of everyone in her orbit forever. The darkness that Richard had always imposed was about to be shaken in ways that no one anticipated. It was around the middle of September 1988 when Richard just disappeared. Richard went to work one day and he simply just never came home.
His wife didn't call the police. His kids didn't say anything about it. He was just gone.
And with Cheryl's wedding looming near, by the time Richard returned, she could have her happy wedding with him gone. Her brother Rick came running to Cheryl with the news that Richard was gone. He implied that her way to a beautiful wedding, the path was now clear, and he told her it was an early wedding present. The wedding went ahead, surprisingly without incident, and was quietly wrapped up in peace. No one in the family questioned Richard's sudden absence. Frankly, everyone was just happy that he was absent. The last time that he had disappeared for 2 months, when he had returned, he was even more monstrous than he had been before he left. This time, though, was different. There were no phone calls to search for him. No missing person reports were filed. The family simply waited, dreading the day that he would return. But 2 weeks passed and Richard didn't return. In fact, he never came back at all. As the months passed by and then years passed by, the family felt a sense of freedom that he was gone and they didn't have to deal with him anymore. It was their first glimpse at life outside the prison that Richard had built around them. In the years that followed, Marilyn felt a renewed sense of purpose and decided it was time that she wanted to finish her education.
Marilyn opened up. She lived a normal life.
She blossomed into this person that I think she always was this person.
She wanted to have a career, and this shift invigorated her. Cheryl was thriving. She was raising a beautiful family, and she was embodying the dream that they had all longed for such a long time. Meanwhile, Stacy had a chance to explore herself. She landed a job at Disney World as a sales associate and embraced a joyful life. Rick's journey was a little bit more tumultuous. He had married a woman who was 2 decades older than him, and his marriage really left him feeling stranded. However, he managed to keep going forward. Cheryl, who was now a nurse, decided to move and live closer to her mother, Marilyn, with her husband and her children. The family dynamic flourished, especially with Marilyn's father, Reagan, being around.
Richard was a loner. He was gone a lot. Stacy and her girlfriend bought a house down the street from the mother's house. And then Richard moved in with them. It's a block away.
It was nice to come home to a cooked meal, and, they'd have game nights. They would go out to dinner and a movie.
They frequently gathered as a family, and Marilyn quickly became the favorite among her grandchildren. However, the whole family was still haunted by the idea that Richard one day could return. And as decades started to go by, the family became more and more comfortable that he was not going to return. The family's life had taken an unexpected turn, and to them, usually unexpected turns were not good things. In this case, it was wonderful for the family. Yet life had one more cruel surprise for the Kananen family. On September 10th, 2003, without warning, Marilyn disappeared. The family's fragile peace was shattered, and a new nightmare began to unfold. One that would once again upend everything that they thought they knew and change the course of their lives forever.
When Marilyn's coworker called Cheryl and said she didn't show up for work today, they all met at Marilyn's house. Ricky was the only one who had a key to the house.
The Kananen siblings, they were convinced that their father, Richard, had returned after all these years, and he was the one who had hurt their mother.
Ricky was telling the girls, he came back. The nightmare is back. He's got her. So Cheryl and Stacy immediately began to panic.
But to the investigators, it seemed like fear was clouding the minds of the 3 children. Richard had vanished without a trace in 1988 when he was 55 years old. Now, at 69 years old, the idea that he had suddenly reappeared after 15 years just to kidnap Marilyn seemed extremely far-fetched. But if it wasn't Richard, then who was it? The family had finally found balance and peace in their life. What could have torn it apart so violently? Investigators were left questioning if the family, in their pursuit of finding peace, had they made any enemies along the way. To find answers, they peeled back the layers of Marilyn's life. She wasn't just a mother and a grandmother. She was also a 65-year-old aviation trainer, and that meant that she had plenty of connection. Could there be someone harboring ill will towards Marilyn? Suspicion grew, and anyone linked to Marilyn or the Kananen family found themselves under a microscope. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Marilyn's sisters came forward to investigators to tell them some very shocking information. This was information that they had kept quiet for years. After Richard's disappearance, Marilyn's sisters asked her if she had any idea of where he was. Marilyn told her sisters that he was in prison, that he had been convicted of a crime and he was actually in prison at the time. Yet, for some reason, his social security checks kept arriving at the home, and Marilyn claimed that she was sending Richard the social security checks. The sisters, they never really believed this story that Marilyn had told them, but they knew how hard Marilyn's life had been with Richard, and they just wanted her to have peace and to be happy, so they never questioned her on the story. But now that she's disappeared, they share this information with the investigators. But there was even more. After their father, Reagan, who's Marilyn's mother, after her father had passed away, she had inherited a very large amount of money. And Marilyn's father had been living with her at the time that he had passed away. Despite this, Marilyn's sisters, they really felt that the family was in a good place at this time, and they didn't want to disrupt anything or cause any problems with any of the family members. Even Stacy and her partner Susan had moved into the neighborhood, settling just a block away from their mother in April 2002. Stacy's condo had plenty of space, and she had a spare room, and she let her brother Rick move into her spare bedroom in her condo. So now all three of the children were living really close by to their mother, Marilyn. And the Kananen family, they took every opportunity they could to celebrate together. They had Easter dinners, Christmas dinners, birthday parties, family get-togethers. They spent a lot of time together, and the family seemed to be doing quite well. April through to September, the family's life was filled with laughter and lots of connection between them. But that harmony was shattered when Marilyn disappeared without a trace. As investigators dug deeper, they found themselves at a crossroads. The family gatherings, however warm, didn't provide any answers. Their focus shifted to something much more tangible: Marilyn's finances. Remember at the beginning of the story when the kids had reported Marilyn missing, I had mentioned that there was a half-drink cup of coffee and social security checks on the table? Remember that, because that came back to the investigators' mind, seeing those social security checks. Police started to remember those social security checks, and then they started thinking about everything that Marilyn's sisters had told them. The investigation took a sharp turn and narrowed in on bank statements, accounts, and the flow of Marilyn's money. In the days following Marilyn's disappearance, a shadow of suspicion began creeping into the family. Well, Cheryl, Stacy, and Rick had all reported their mother missing and shared the belief that their father had returned to either hurt her or kidnap her. Cheryl, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The deeper she looked, the more isolated she felt. And now some shady shit's about to go down. Cheryl started noticing that her siblings were slowly moving the mother's belongings out of her condo. With no discussion and no explanation, it was as if they knew that Marilyn was not returning. And Cheryl wondered, did they know something that she didn't? The first clue was much more chilling.
Cheryl knew something about the bank records. And so she provided us with some of the accounts and the names. And so we started to look into those. And there was a lot of money changing hands.
Marilyn's money had been redirected to go into Stacy and Rick's bank accounts.
There were checks being written electronically from an off-site computer that went to Stacy and Richard, but nothing to Cheryl and her kids. You know, they paid off their vehicles, and Richard went out and paid cash for a brand new Dodge truck. I think about $40,000 worth.
How long had this been happening, and why had they been keeping her in the dark?
Mark had called me and he said, "Did you get money from your mom?" No. Well, Stacy and Ricky did. And Stacy and Ricky have new cars, and Stacy and Ricky did this, and Stacy and Ricky did that. And it was all with my mom's stuff.
And then came the garage sale. Stacy and her partner Susan had decided to sell off Marilyn's prized Disney collection. It was a massive collection, and it was extremely, extremely important to Marilyn.
I don't know if I thought that they had hurt her, but I knew that their stories were not adding up very quickly. And there came a point during the investigation that I was sure they knew what happened or where she was.
Detective Mark Hussey, he was overseeing the case, and he happened to come upon the sale. So he immediately called Cheryl, because Cheryl was not any part of selling any of Marilyn's belongings. It was only Rick and Stacy, the other two siblings. When Mark Hussey called Cheryl, he was very stern, and he wanted to know if she knew what was happening, and she didn't know anything at all. That's when everything started to shift. The grief, the confusion, it was all giving way to something darker, something far more unsettling. Marilyn's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case. Every detail, every secret, every quiet transaction was all now pointing in one ominous direction. The truth, it seemed, was far more twisted than Cheryl had ever imagined. With Rick now attempting to unfreeze his account so he could access Marilyn's money, that's when Detective Mark Hussey decided, I need to bring him in and we need to have a conversation. But Rick, not wanting to go along, convinced Stacy to go along with him. And obviously when two people come in and someone's being questioned, the first thing the police are going to do is separate the two of them and see if they could see any difference in the story that either of them gave. Nothing really came of separating them. So police tried another tactic that's very common in police interrogations, is they put the two of them in a room. And obviously they put them in a room together because the police want to be able to overhear any conversations that they're having. They were whispering to each other, so the police were not able to hear everything that they did say, but there were some very incriminating things that were said. In a very hushed voice, Rick said to Stacy that he may end up in the gas chamber. The statement was cryptic, unsettling, and suggested far more than just fear of legal trouble. Despite the chilling exchange, Rick and Stacy were eventually released. They had no idea, however, that the investigation was far from over. As they drove away thinking that they were free, they did not know that while they had been in the police department, they had placed a tracking device on Rick's car. This way, the police could watch Rick's every move from now on. After leaving the police station, Rick and Stacy made a stop at a local pharmacy. From there, they drove directly to one of Rick's storage units. Unbeknownst to the two of them, they were being closely tailed by Sergeant Hussey. He was keeping a watchful eye on their every move. At the storage unit, Hussey observed something very alarming. Rick and Stacy jotted down a few notes, took some medication, and did something even more unsettling. They began running a hose from the exhaust in the back, like in the back of a car, a hose so that it would fill into the car, which obviously is a way that some people do to attempt to unalive themselves. But because Sergeant Hussey was there, he immediately put a stop to it before either of them were able to unalive themselves. Inside the car, he found a bottle of NyQuil and sleeping pills. But it was the two letters sitting on the dashboard that sent a shockwave through him. One letter was addressed to Cheryl. In it, Rick had written a heartfelt message telling Cheryl that he loved her. The second letter was meant for Susan. And Susan was Stacy's partner. And in that letter, she had written, "We had a part in Mother's leaving." Super sus. These words were more than a farewell. They were a confession. What had started as a missing persons case was now undeniably much darker. The truth about Marilyn's disappearance was finally surfacing. But after the failed unaliving attempt, when Stacy got to the hospital, she refused to speak. But Rick, he had a whole lot to say. What they expected to be a single confession turned into a bombshell involving two murders, one of which they weren't even investigating. Rick calmly admitted that he had killed his mother, Marilyn. But he had also murdered his father 15 years earlier. His motive for both were chilling and straightforward. Rick explained that he had tasered and suffocated Marilyn, and it was because she was about to inherit $250,000 from her father passing away, and Rick killed her because he wanted the money. As for his father, Richard, Rick confessed to shooting him in his sleep back in 1988 simply because he disliked him. The confessions did not stop there. Rick also told them where they could find the body. Richard had been buried in the backyard of Marilyn's house, and Marilyn was buried in the backyard of Stacy and Susan's home. With this confession, Rick was immediately detained. But there remained a gnawing sense of unfinished business for the investigators.
I was told by the detective that my father had been shot in the back of the head, and he was sure that my sister had done it because she was the only one around at the time.
Despite Rick's full admission, there was nothing concrete linking Stacy to either crime. Yet the investigators were convinced that she was not just an innocent bystander. They believed that she was either Rick's accomplice or worse, possibly the mastermind behind both murders. Rick Kananen Jr. was set to stand trial for both of his parents' murders on May 1st, 2007. Just days before the trial, a plea deal was placed on the table if he would agree to testify against his sister Stacy. If he testified truthfully that she was a willing accomplice, his sentence would be reduced to 30 years in prison. Ricky, who had always been fiercely protective of both his sisters through their abusive childhood, shocked everyone by accepting the deal and testifying against his sister Stacy. Stacy was then promptly arrested for the murder of both of their parents. Nearly 3 years later, on March 10th, 2010, Stacy's trial finally began. And it quickly became clear that this case would be anything but simple. The prosecution, led by Robin Wilkinson, renowned for her sharp, direct style, was confident in her ability to link Stacy to the crimes. Diane Tennis, who was Stacy's defense attorney, was equally self-assured that she could argue that Stacy had been wrongfully accused based on flimsy police work and a complete lack of evidence. But the most crucial testimony of the trial came from Rick himself.
It's really memorable to me still. We knew that Richard Jr. had struggled mentally, that he lived in a very dark and violent reality in his mind. He was unshaven. He really played the part of this crazy guy living in his own reality.
According to Rick's version of events, the siblings had meticulously planned their mother's murder.
Did you kill your mother?
Yes, I did.
And was someone there to assist you in killing your mother?
Yes, there was.
And who was that?
Stacy, my sister.
They started the evening like any other. They took Marilyn out to see a movie, and then they had dinner together and went back to Marilyn's house. They were sitting around, and Rick kept Marilyn focused on the conversation with him while Stacy took a taser and tased Marilyn. This caused Marilyn to fall to the floor, and then Rick had stepped in and using a bandana, he used it to strangle and finish the job of taking his mother's life.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how did you suffocate your mother?
I took a bandana and put it over her mouth and her nose.
When do you pull the bandana up?
After a while,
Why'd you pull it up?
there wasn't no breathing.
As he describes Stacy using the taser on her mother, him suffocating her, Stacy at the defense table begins to crack just a little bit. She's been very composed up until this point. It was the first time that we'd really seen emotion from her.
What was your sister doing as you're suffocating your mother?
She was standing over there, over me.
During the trial, when he was testifying, he looked at my sister a lot. I think he never thought that my sister would be free this long.
Together, they transported the body and buried it, hoping to cover their tracks. Cheryl, the older sister, she also took the stand, describing how she had noticed something deeply unsettling in the days following the mother's disappearance.
After your mother was missing, are you still calling the sheriff's office all the time?
Constantly.
Does your sister Stacy ever call you to talk about your mother?
Never.
What about Richard?
Never.
They didn't do any of the normal things that one might expect from children looking for their missing elderly mother.
Both Stacy and Rick, she testified, seemed unnervingly indifferent. Their behavior wasn't just strange, it was completely out of character, fueling her suspicion that something more sinister was at play. With every piece of testimony, the courtroom drama intensified as the lines between guilt and innocent began to blur.
Ms. Tennis, call your witness.
Defense would call Stacy Kananen.
We were all pretty surprised, I think, when Stacy took the stand.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm?
By all accounts, all of these children were horrifically abused. Marilyn Kananen was horrifically abused. I think that the evidence is going to show you that that culture of abuse is going to leave you with a number of people who don't ever act the way non-abused people are going to act in any given situation. A lot of this is not going to make sense.
Calling your own defendant to the stand is a tough decision. You know, it's always a gamble.
To me, it was never a question. There were enough legitimate questions brought up by that evidence that I didn't think were going to go unanswered.
Was Stacy a cold-blooded accomplice, or was she an innocent sibling that got dragged into this?
Tell the jury, what did you learn when you were a child about defending yourself?
The more you fought back, the more you argued, the worse you got beaten or whatever the abuse was of the day.
The truth lay buried somewhere within the Kananen family's twisted past.
Richard Sr., you know, all 6'4" of them, of evil, really loomed over that courtroom. One of the most shocking points in the testimony to me about Richard Sr. was one night when he had taken his girls for a drive. He stopped at a bar, got hammered.
How old would you have been?
6th grade, I'm not sure of the age. And then he decided, well, we'll go back home. I don't know, it was after the bar closed, 2 in the morning, 1 in the morning. And when we came in the house, my sister went to where we had our bunk beds. He told my mother, you're not sleeping in the room with me. Stacy's going in the room with me. My brother was sleeping in the living room on a pull-out sofa at that time. We went in the bedroom. He locked the door. He pulled out a handgun. And then with the gun in my mouth.
The way that this affected Stacy is that she learned to just shut up and just be as invisible as possible.
The trial of Stacy hinged on one really significant key piece of evidence, the letter that she had left. With the haunting line, "We had a part in Mother's leaving." The prosecution took this as a very damning admission of guilt, painting Stacy as a willing participant in the murder of their mother. But Stacy had an explanation that would change everything.
And do you recall there being the first conversation about there being an actual attempt?
He told me that because Susan and I own that house, and because that body was going to be found in my backyard, if I didn't or do something to myself, that they surely would come after Susan also.
She was just sort of tired and out of it and didn't really know what was going on, was just trying to sort of get this over with. And somehow Richard apparently convinces Stacy that the only way out.
When she wrote what she explained she meant by the line, "We had a part in Mother's leaving," is she felt genuinely responsible that if she hadn't invited Ricky to live with them, their mom would still be alive.
Ultimately, Stacy's trial came down to one pivotal fact. Where was Marilyn on the day that she died? Because Rick had told them that they had been together and they had gone to the movies, they had had dinner together. So Rick's story was that they were all together doing these things, but his story crumbled very quickly.
The jury had seen testimony into what the defense claimed was the mind of Ricky the manipulator. Now, the jurors were about to look deep into what the defense claimed was the mind of a murderer.
It was a handwritten document, this thick, stack of papers, and it was called The Scales of Justice.
The draft novel was discovered by Susan and Stacy, who turned it over to police after Ricky was first arrested. It contained chilling descriptions of its main character killing child with his bare hands.
To see the fear in the eyes as you squeeze their throat, as the larynx is being crushed. In it, he tells a story of a young man who grows up to save children.
The way the victims in his novel were bound had eerie similarities to how Marilyn's body was found.
You see them trying to cry out, but the duct tape works so well. Their hands and feet spread eagle and tied down so very little movement can happen.
The main character's father's name is Richard, correct?
I guess so.
And it's about a child who kills his abusive parent?
Yes.
As the trial drew to a close, the courtroom became a battlefield of belief. Some saw Stacy as a victim, a woman swept up in the horrors of her family's past, while others saw her as guilty, Rick's accomplice in a cold-blooded murder of their mother. In the end, the verdict stunned everyone. Stacy Kananen was acquitted of all charges. Despite the letter, despite the suspicions, the court found that the evidence simply wasn't strong enough to prove her involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. For some, justice had been served. For others, the truth remained elusive. But for Stacy, after years of darkness, she was finally free.
Do you want to pull the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Call the jury, please.
I'm going to call you by badge number.
Well, I'm a crier, so I immediately start the waterworks because that's what I do.
Yes, ma'am.
I think she cried too. I think we were both somewhat surprised, and I think we were both incredibly relieved.
Stacy was acquitted. Rick was to be released in 2029. All his life, Rick had feared becoming like his father. We can't say if he became like his father, but he became a murderer. And as for the two sisters, Cheryl cut off contact with Stacy post-trial. I believe probably Cheryl believes that Stacy was involved. I personally myself believe Stacy was involved.
My sister's there with her suit and her supporters. And, you know, my brother fit the package that they wanted to fit. He looked like the murderer and he looked like the horrible person. And let's just tie this all up and put it on a bow and send him away, and we won't have to think about this anymore.
Stacy went back to Florida. She's still with Susan, and she ended up writing a book called Fear of My Father. And it was based on the atrocities and the abuse she and the family had suffered. For Cheryl, the ordeal had been an emotional roller coaster. While she did not believe in her sister's innocence, the trial had exposed fractures within their family that may never heal.
I know in my heart that justice wasn't done. No doubt in my mind.
The bond of sisterhood was forever altered as both siblings faced the realities of their shared past. So that is the end of today's story. I hope that you found it interesting. I would love to know your thoughts, specifically your thoughts about Stacy. And through the whole video, every time I say Stacy, all I want to do is sing Stacy's mom has got it going on. Stacy's mom has got it going on. But yeah. Anyways, I withheld through the whole video not singing that, so I just had to put it in there at the end. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on this whole thing. It's just a wild, crazy story. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe if you have not. And if you would like to support the channel, please stick around and watch another video. Do something today that makes your soul happy, and I will see you in the next one.